Hello, can you hear me well? Is it okay? Thank you. Well, first of all, my sincere thanks to Occulture Berlin, all its lecturers and organizers for having me here, for featuring my work. As you may have seen around, it's all around now. I didn't expect it to be this profuse, and it's very nice. So I'm being invited to give a talk on my artwork and my research at the same time, because I think they're both basically the same thing, they are intertwined. And this talk aims to shed some light on my latest book, Yao, some of you might know it, published through Anathema Publishing, and the work that is to come as well. So this one is the latest work that I've done, and it's not yet out, so to speak, so let's see what happens with what is to come yet. So you may have seen this boy on our culture poster already, and we have the abraxas, which is the most commonly known Gnostic gemstones. When speaking of just Gnostic remains, I will use the term remains because I'm not only working with gemstones. What usually comes to mind is this figure, the gemstones known as abraxas. Yet different categories of such remains have survived, not only stones, and in our process of reconstructing them, we will try to include not only the celebrated magical stones, but records engraved on different supports, such as reliefs, Roman graffiti, and even purely written accounts that we will translate into images. The results aspire to be an effort that contrasts all of these sources to bring such images back to life. So it was around 2014, when I had not yet finished my formation as a visual artist in Peru, that I rendered my first version of the Gnostic Knubis, identified with the Aldabaoth by, I think, Origen of Alexandria. And so this image, I did it based on the work of Origen of Alexandria, as I just said, entitled Contra Kelsun, which identified the lion-headed archon with Saturn. That's why he has a Saturn symbol on the lower part. And since then, I have to say this image has exploded in popularity to the point that it has gone way beyond my own control. And yet I consider it to be not only the echo of what was to come, in fact. So it was a very first attempt of what I would develop later. Many reproductions of these drawings have been made with and without my authorization, so now it's all over the internet, sometimes without my knowledge or consent. I cannot control it anymore, and people just surprise me with new prints and new version of this. They just get tattooed sometimes, without knowing it's by me, so that happens. This is the world of the internet. But the finest version so far that I have found is by Detelina Ivanova. It's this beautiful lapis lazuli carved version that brings the image that I did on paper back to stone. So that was a fitting conversion, so to speak, of genres. The strength of this image comes from the fact that it has come to represent or embody the most shocking aspect of Gnostic theology for a Christian audience. That is the demiurge, a Platonic idea that the Gnostics took to the extreme. It consists of the notion of the creator as an imperfect God, and sometimes even an evil God. But moving forward from the gemstones, as we have promised, another image that caused fascination in me was the Roman graffiti that shows Alexamenos worshipping his god, Alexamenos Ebetetheon, commonly identified as an early mockery against a Christian soldier, in this case Alexamenos. The Victorian writer Charles William King proposed in the 19th century that a Gnostic reading of this image was possible, where it would have represented syncretism between Christ and Anubis, both being guides for the afterlife, or psychopompos. So is this blasphemy or devotion? That's a big question here. This is a paradox that cannot be answered, in my opinion, but I want to propose that such a bipolarity was an essential feature of Gnostic religiosity, where transgression and reverence are alternate in a puzzling way. Patterns that Edward Conze would call antinomian religiosity, in the comparison that Edward Conze did between Mahayana Buddhism and Gnosticism. On the other hand, those who viewed this image as blasphemous, which has been the most common interpretation, to think that it's simply a blasphemous graffito, interpreted the animal as having the head of a donkey, in fact, so not a dog instead of a donkey. I think you should tell me if you see a donkey or a dog there. I'm not really sure in the original, so that's up to interpretation. I have chosen the dog in this case. So the donkey-headed animal is a figure that we will explore shortly, and that's a problem. So contrasting the crudeness of this graffito, my most recent work that I want to feature for the first time here is a reconstruction of a Roman limestone relief from the 3rd century AD that was auctioned by Christie's in 2010, and which depicts an unknown, heavily syncretistic god. So I don't know what this piece is right now. If somebody knows, I want to see it. Please let me know. It's somewhere in somebody's private collection now, so we cannot actually have public access to it, but I think it's quite outstanding, and I wanted to do my own interpretation of this heavily syncretistic nameless god, in fact. So it is important to remark for me that many, if not most, of the deities depicted in Gnostic gemstones, they have not been identified. And that Abraxas itself, the word, is a misspelled version of the name Abrasax as it appears in the gemstones. Moreover, it has become an umbrella term. Abraxas basically means any stone that looks vaguely magical, syncretistic, or Alexandrian for the deities of the said period. So maybe we might use Abraxas for technical purposes, but it's not accurate, so just to make that clear. Abraxas, it's a mistranslation. It was actually a problem from translating Greek into Latin in some writers, it seems. So the technical term actually used in catalogs is angipes, which means the serpent foot, serpent feet, which is actually an attribute that this creature has as well. He has serpent foot. This actually was not unique to Abraxas at all, but it in fact appeared in all representations of giants in late antiquity, in the Hellenistic period, so to speak, as shown in the Pergamon altar preserved here in Berlin. I don't know if the Pergamon is accessible right now, but the Pergamon has giants with serpent feet just as Abraxas. So it was just a development of these giants that kept becoming more and more fantastical as they introduced more Egyptian deities. So these remains are full of nameless gods. That's important to remark. We don't know the names of these creatures. I would like to know, but maybe it is interesting that we don't know them. Because the theological initiative, one could say, yes, sorry, let me know if you can hear me, please, would be to take the late antique concept of an unknown god, which St. Paul understood to be a prophecy of the coming of his abstract and one god. So for St. Paul, the agnotos theos, the unknown god, was the Christian god. But this concept was already present. And so instead of including this, for speaking of the Christian god, we are using the unknown god to speak of the multiplicity of emanations and cross-pollinations that happened in late paganism and that also intermingled with Christianity. One could say this is reverse Pauline theology, if God wills it. It may as well be described as an exercise of extreme affirmative theology, the expression of a philosophical and metaphysical posture. If the divine cannot be defined, neither should it be limited, let's say. Perhaps a great example of this unknown deity can be found in the Acephalos, which might be very known for those into Thelema or Crowley, a figure unique to the Greek magical papyri, which would, through Aleister Crowley, in fact, acquire an immense popularity in modern occultism. During my research, both academic as well as ritual, two interpretations of this figure have arisen to me. One is that it embodies a faceless, ineffable God, as the one in Exodus who says to Moses, "None shall see my face and live," Exodus 33:20. A figure that manifests and hides at the same time, an occult revelation, so to speak. The other, based on Preissendant's interpretation, is that it reveals a gruesome reality of how corpses of those who had died in a violent death, were from the earliest times, this is the Narmer palette, in fact, used for magical purposes. So actually in this one we see both the Gnostic interpretation in a gemstone, but also the Narmer palette, which was Preissendant's hypothesis that actually the headless corpse was used for black magical purposes, as corpses are still used in the Middle Ages, were still used in the Middle Ages and up to modernity as source for black magic material, basically, raw material. But also, Preissendant considers that this image on the lower right, no, left, has 5 serpent heads. So that's also up to interpretation. Do you see snake heads? Do you see a headless figure in that one? That's also something that we should consider. I haven't went yet to the serpent heads, but it's maybe something that we should consider for an upcoming work. And our next step, sort of final step, is reconstructions based on purely written sources, yet making use of the iconographies that we have already introduced and selected. One of such Gnostic mythological aspects is the sequence of the 7 archons, described in various sources, such as the treatise on the origin of the world, found at Nag Hammadi, or the already mentioned Contra Celsum. According to Paul Corby-Finney, and his chapter on the question of Gnostic images, if the archons were, and I quote, monsters with composite attributes, both zoomorphic and anthropomorphic, although lost, these pictures surely constituted Gnostic iconography. So for those into my recent book or into my work, Gnostic iconography is basically what I'm trying to reconstruct, and that's what I'm actually quoting this question, his article, if there is Gnostic iconography, or if they were, and if it was lost. So certainly the archons are the one aspect that we could say it was. End quote, of course. The order of animals of the 7 archons were in Contra Celsum, Michael, who was to be a lion, Suriel, a bull, I will see it as well. Raphael was said to be a dragon or an amphibious being, sort of a frog. It's not really understood in translations. They variate. Gabriel was an eagle, Taltabaot was a bear, Erataot was a dog, and Onoel was a donkey. So here we come back to the talking donkey. In our reconstruction, the initiate is guided by the dog-headed Hermes, as preserved in a sculpture in the Vatican museums. Some of you might have seen there is a nice sculpture in the Vatican of the dog-headed Hermes. And Gabriel and Suriel are derived from depictions of Horus and of Attis as well. And as according to Professor Campbell Bona, it was from Egyptian religion that the Gnostics borrowed their imagery, basically. And so we get to the promised donkey-headed man, employed for the archon Onoel. This figure steps out to question the initiate, as the ritual might have been reconstructed, aiming to test his knowledge, in this case, gnosis, of course, literally. The Gnostic was taught the secret names of the archons, so that he could recognize them in an after-death journey, and thus be able to open the gates. It is also plausible to assume that such ritual of death and rebirth took place in this lifetime, in fact. And the second epistle to Timothy seems to be speaking about this earliest of heretics, when it speaks of false teachers, and I quote, who have departed from the truth. They say that the resurrection has already taken place, end quote. A passage which corresponds directly to the Gnostic teaching that we find in the apocryphal Gospel of Philip, and I quote again, those who say that they will die first and resurrect later are mistaken. If they do not receive resurrection first as they live, when they die, they shall receive nothing. This is quite interesting, and end quote. But what about the donkey? We have the donkey again. So finally, it was recorded by Epiphanius that perhaps one of the earliest blasphemies against Christianity was a graffiti, blasphemous, done by an apostate, a convert that had abandoned the early Christian community and who drew a picture in the city of a donkey-headed man clothed with a toga, holding a book. In this case, he has a scroll, of course. And the picture said, Deus Christianorum Onocoetes, meaning, this is Onocoetes, the donkey-headed, the god of the Christians. Epiphanius actually comments that this was very offensive and very problematic because there were very few Christians back then, and the whole town was laughing about them because of this graffiti that was actually a mockery of the hidden god that they wouldn't represent back then, it seems. So I consider this to be consistent with the Gnostic worldview, where the revelation is an obscure one, in fact, and the rulers of the heavens and even the ruler of this world are perceived as imperfect, wicked, and even supernaturally evil sometimes. The suspicion that the one God hides a horrifying secret, that the deity cannot be represented is secretly a monster, an intuition that has followed me my whole life, and thus my subscription to such a view is not a rational choice, I would say, but an emotional one. I would also include this figure in my reconstruction of the Ophite diagram, which is a larger drawing, described by Origen as well. This is the main point that I derive from Origen, is in the Ophite diagram. It has been perhaps my most ambitious project so far, and I have been able to find 4 academic sources reconstructing the diagram. However, none of these sources would fit all circles inside one. So here the donkey speaks the law, he has the book, and he says, just as in the graffiti, Deus Christianorum Onocoetes. This is the whole diagram. You may have seen it. But so far in the sources that I have found in reconstructing versions, the diagram could not fit all circles inside one. as it is stated by the text itself, as stated by Origen in the beginning of this text. So the compromise that I had to take was including the 7 further names corresponding to the gates of the archons horizontally. So we have vertically the 7 archons and horizontally the 7 gates, and that way it can all fit. This is a compromise that I have done regarding the texts. If somebody has a better reading or a better reconstruction, let me know, because I've done my best here, but I want this to be open to discussion, open to reconstruction, because I want help on this. I've done my best, but I've been working alone so far, so please let me know. And as such, I do recognize my biases, and the fact that my own formation as an art historian will never allow me to approach the complex topic of Gnosticism with the sharpness of a real specialist, of course. But I want to express my commitment to this faith in knowledge as we could understand the message of the Pistis Sophia. And thus, I want to open dialogue and discussion on these matters. So basically, I would say that the sole purpose of my art is to bring new attention to the message that has been revealed by the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library. Nowadays, Gnostic gemstones are rarely shown to the public in museum cabinets due to the roughness of the craftsmanship. In fact, the actual Gnostic gemstones were much uglier than the Renaissance reconstructions that were done. So real Gnostic gemstones tend to be really ugly, let's be honest. And that's why they are not depicted, in fact. The real stuff is usually not in museum cabinets because it doesn't have really artistic value or historical value because it's too fringe sometimes for the museographic discourse. So that's interesting, and that keeps it as a fringe category. And so that's a problem that we have to consider, and so the Campbell-Boner Magical Gemstones database constitutes one of the most valuable online research resources for the research. So these are my scholarly reconstructions. I can share them later if you want. It might be just two little letters, but those are the reconstructions of the Ophite diagram that I have been able to find so far. And this is the Campbell-Boner database. So if you want to check Gnostic gemstones, this is, as far as I know, the best catalog that you can find online. For the research, actually, you will find Abraxas here as Angipes. That's why I was introducing the term. If you want to search for him, you must search for the serpent-feeded animal, not Abraxas itself. It won't help. So yeah, I just say to everybody, if you want to go deeper into this stuff, go to the Campbell-Boner database. It's endless. It has stuff from museums all over the world. So as conclusions, I do believe that in late antiquity, the Gnostics found themselves in the same challenges that we face today. That is, finding ultimate meaning in a world where the multiplicity of narratives and beliefs has become undeniable. Therefore, I believe that syncretism is not only necessary, but it is inescapable if any spiritual approach is to be kept alive. It is due to the plain hardness of their material, their discrete size, and the immortally powerful magical aura that they emanate, that Gnostic magical gemstones could survive the complete destruction that the tradition of their authors underwent. This is how they speak to us across the millennia, and how a forgotten history and nameless gods have been kept for us in discrete remains. And the purpose of my work is ultimately to listen to the silent voice of the glyptic communications and bring them back to life, with new energy and maybe with new blood. Thank you so much.